What's up? This is a quick tutorial on how to use expression strings in range research. We're in the range research window of Hand to Node, and down the left hand side we have our custom range research reports. So these are range research reports that can be run based on specific criteria. For example, if we have a look at the donk tag, we can see that this processes all players in the database who meet the criteria that's defined in both the expression string and also any of the other filters that can be toggled here. For example, we can set that a donk is someone who has a VPIP over 22, but also in the expression string there, we can see some code. It only looks at players who have an open limp stat larger than 5%. Now the syntax won't immediately be obvious. To get more information regarding how the syntax works, we can click on that syntax button with the question mark by it. We're directed to a web page which gives us information regarding the basic commands we can use as part of that expression string. Most important ones are here on the page. In this tutorial, we're going to be using value and we're going to be using ops. However, as we can see, there are plenty of other commands that can be used to formulate that expression string. Further to the commands on this page, we'll see that we can make use of even more advanced scripting language. For example, it says you may use conditional operator if and other mathematical functions. Now we're going to be using at least one operator. We're going to be using the AND operator because in the string that we're going to construct in this tutorial, we actually want to define two conditions for whether something passes through the filter for range research. So we'll have condition number 1, we'll have the operator AND followed by condition number 2. Those are not the only operators that can be used. We can use if operators. And for the full list of the scope of this particular programming language, we click on the More Info button. We're going to get taken to another page. It starts talking about this ncalc language. And if you want to find further information, it makes sense to head on over to the GitHub page, which is linked to there, because apparently this particular page is not maintained. You can pass by this page on your way towards the GitHub repository. Now most of this is unnecessary. This is really here for reference just in case you want to create some kind of advanced statement, but for the most part this is just not going to be necessary. I can't really think of too many reasons why we'd need to really break out the full scope of this scripting language. So let's return to Hand to Node. We're going to have a look at a more realistic problem that we might face. Let's have a look at the NIT range research report. Now we're going to pretend that the expression string is blank. In fact, it's not blank at the moment, but there's a certain bug. You can see we have this code here. Now what's supposed to be here is the name of a stat, but this particular stat is not found in the files for this particular Hand to Node install. So obviously this is not going to work. If we click the verify button, you can see it doesn't like this expression. What we're going to do is we're going to just start this expression from scratch. What we're attempting to do here is to make a condition. So this is a NIT profile. We've already specified that the VPIP of the player is going to be less than 17 in order to pass through into the range research report. We'd like to make this other specification where in order for the player to pass through, he has to have a 3-bet value of less than 5%. And also the number of opportunities on the 3-bet stat has to be larger than 20. So opportunities is an important thing to keep in mind. Because let's say, for example, we have a player who hasn't played any hands. He's only been at the table for, let's say, 5 hands. He's got a 0% VPIP and he's never 3-bet. He's actually going to pass through this filter. Whereas the truth is, this guy could actually be a loose aggressive player. He just didn't pick up a decent hand over 5 hands, so he's not entered into the pot. Now there's more than one way of doing this. We can specify the number of opportunities for the specific stat in question. So in this case, that's the 3-bet preflop stat. Or we can specify an overall hand sample, or both. So for example, here where it says hands, we have 100 to infinity. That means in order for any player to pass through this particular range research report, we have to have at least 100 hands on him and have larger than 23-bet opportunities. Now you can play around with the numbers. The exact numbers we choose are probably going to depend somewhat on the size of the database of hands we have. In this case, we're working with a pretty large database. But let's just say if the database is not that large, even having 100 default hands in order to pass through the range research report is not realistic. 23-bet opportunities might not be realistic. The way we can figure out if it's realistic is just to go to the main screen in Hand to Note, sort all of the players by number of hands, and if we see there's only 20 guys in our database that have more than 100 hands, then it's probably not a good idea to set that as the minimum criteria for hands played. Might want to make it 50 or something. But you can gauge it by looking at that initial screen and just seeing how many players have over that minimum criteria, because we want to be taking into account a decent number of players where possible. But as a counterbalance to that, we don't want the minimum criteria for number of hands to be so low that the results of the range research start to include players who shouldn't really be part of that report. So first thing we need to do is we need to find the name of the stat we want to use. So the syntax is value. That's going to have a look at the value of a certain stat for each player in the database. So we want to find the name of the 3-bet stat. So we head into the stats editor and we can see on the Death Star HUD the name of the preflop 3-bet stat. It's called WZL 3-bet, then in brackets it says 3-bet preflop. Now this is a lesson that I had to find out the hard way. We have to be careful using stats that have brackets in the name. Why is that the case? Because it tends to interfere with the expression syntax that we're trying to write an expression string for. Now there might be a way of escaping these brackets, I don't know. What I do know is that the easiest solution is simply to clone the stat and rename it to something else. So I'm going to click the clone button here, and I'm simply going to rename this stat to WZL 3-bet PF. So now we have the name of a stat that has no brackets in. It's not going to interfere with the expression string. So now let's head back to the range research window. We know the name of our stat. So we've got the command value, then we have in brackets the name of the stat, which is going to be WZL 3-bet PF. Then we have a space, then we have a smaller than sign. Hopefully we've seen that sign before. Smaller than 5. And there's a space between the 5 and the smaller than sign. Another space, here is where we insert an operator. So we've got and. Now, there might be other ways of expressing this in the language. We might be able to type and, I don't know. What I do know is that one way of expressing this particular operator is doing 2 and signs. And that's usually on most keyboards, Shift and 7. We'll find the and symbol there. It could be in a different place on your keyboard. Probably depends on the layout, the country of your keyboard, etc. We've got 2 ands, we've got another space. We then have this command, ops. This is for opportunities. We'd see it again if we went back to the syntax web page. We have opportunities. We need to input the name of the stat again. So let's delete this error code that's being generated by a stat that wasn't found. I'm going to type in the name of the 3-bet stat. And we put a space larger than space 20. So what does this command actually mean when translated? It means that in order for a player to pass through the range research filter and be part of the range research report, that player must have a 3-bet stat smaller than 5% and the number of opportunities that he's had in order to 3-bet is larger than 20. Now we can tweak the numbers ourselves. The important thing is to understand how and what we've done here with the syntax. Next step is to click verify. If everything's okay, we should get this green check mark. If, and as mentioned, I had to learn this lesson the hard way, if it doesn't like something about the expression string, it's not going to give you that green tick. For example, if your stats have brackets in the name. So if I had some stat where, let's just add some brackets in and see what it does to the script. Some extra brackets, click verify. It just doesn't like that. You get this message here, results should be true or false. Now that's not actually the correct name of the stat, but even if it was, we're going to get a similar message. We just want one set of brackets here. So we may need to take that extra step of renaming some of the stats we want to use as part of our range research report. Now the next step is obviously to try and run the report. I know already that this is not going to work. Let's just see what happens. We'll click the rebuild button. So it's going to try and process this particular range research report. So I've clicked the button. It's actually just looking for players right now. So you can see it's telling us there's 92,000 players in the database. And we're probably thinking, well, at this stage, surely it should have found a player, right? Someone with a VPIP of less than 17, someone whose criteria matches up with the expression string that we provided. You can see it's just not finding anyone. I'm just going to leave that to run. So we're seeing now the results of the report. Obviously the result is that there is no result. We don't have any players passing through the filter. So the question is that because we've written our expression string incorrectly, or is there something else wrong with our filter, or are there simply no players in this database passing through? And the answer is none of those. The problem here is that hand2note appears to be checking players against pre-built versions of this stat. In other words, when we import our hands for the first time and we generate stats based on the population, it creates a list of values, who has which value for which stat, etc. hand2note is essentially looking for that right now, apart from there are no values there, because we've literally just created this stat. So firstly, we're going to have to clear and rebuild the stats in our database. There doesn't appear to be a way of doing that for a single stat. We're going to have to clear and rebuild everything before this is going to work. But before we can do that, there's still one problem we need to overcome. The issue is when we clear and rebuild stats with hand2note, it doesn't populate values for every single stat that we've created ever. It specifically populates values that are going to be used by a certain set of pop-ups, for example. So when we clear and rebuild these stats, we can't just clear and rebuild. We need to make sure that the specific stat we want to be processed will be being processed. Now, towards the end of the pop-ups in DeathStar, and if you're using a different HUD configuration, you can just add a new tab into your pop-ups. I like to have a specific pop-up tab just for maintenance. The idea is if we search for the 3-bet stat, if we go to 3-bet PF here, let's just drag and drop this stat here. Now, we've got no intention of ever really using this stat. We've already got our 3-bet preflop stats somewhere else in the pop-ups. We're doing this because when we clear and rebuild the stats, it's going to force hand2note to calculate values for this specific stat. It recognizes it's part of our pop-ups. It's going to calculate values for this stat for every player in the database. Once we've done that, we can then run the range research report, and we can expect hand2note to find values for this stat for each player because they've already been built. Whereas right now, we're not finding any values because those values haven't been constructed yet. So we add that to a blank part of the pop-up somewhere. We click Save. We're now going to clear and rebuild our stats. Now, obviously, this is potentially going to take some time if you have a big database, so be prepared to clear the stats, go away, and come back. In fact, that's what I'm going to do. There are 15 million hands in this database, so it's unfortunate we have to rebuild every single stat for the sake of the new additional stat we've created, but it's going to be worth it in the end because we have to run some very, very cool range research reports. So here we go. Are you sure you want to clear stats in the database? Yes, we're sure. This is not clearing any information from the database. It's not clearing any of the hand histories. It's purely clearing the stats that are generated based on those hand histories, then repopulating them. So I'm not going to lose any info that can't be rebuilt. I'm just going to click yes. I'm going to go back to the beginning. This is where, depending on the size of our database, we'll potentially go away and come back again. So I clicked build stats. We can see it's now processing. You can see that there's still another 14.8 million hands to go. So I'm just going to leave this and I'm going to resume the video after it's processed all the stats, and we can continue with our range research report. So the stats have been built, which means the stat definition we want to use has been populated with values. We can now use it. Now, just before we proceed, I want to point out there was another reason why we wouldn't have found any matches for the previous range report. And that's because VPIP to PFR was set from between 0 and 0. So even if we did have values for the stat we were trying to use, we wouldn't have found any players in the database anyway because this VPIP to PFR section was not configured. We'll set it to how it should be, between 0 and 100, just to demonstrate the idea of the expression string not working correctly if the stats have not been cleared and rebuilt. I've created another definition. I created it by cloning the 3-bet preflop. I've just added an E on the end, so it's now called WZL 3-bet PFE. It's a stat that hasn't been processed. If we click verify, we'll get the check mark, but when we click rebuild, it's not going to find any players. I'll leave it on for 10 to 15 seconds, but as you can see, it hasn't found any players so far. You just have to take my word for it that it's not going to find any players because this particular stat has not been populated with values from the database. Now, if we return to our original stat, which has been processed, we can do that by just deleting the E of both of these stats. Click the verify button, we get the green check mark. This time when we click rebuild, it's going to find players in the database. We'll see that. There we go, 1 player found, 3 players found. The exact number of players found will of course depend on how stringent the filters are. For example, we'll find a certain number. You can see we're not finding that many out of a database of 92,000. Looks like we're going to find in the region of perhaps 200. See 257 players used to populate this range research report. We might decide that that's not enough for us, in which case we can just modify some of the filters. So if we wanted a report that's going to allow more players to pass through the filter, sometimes at the sake of profile accuracy, in other words, some players might creep into the filter who don't legitimately form part of the profile, but in some ways that will increase our accuracy with the values of the stats because we'll have a bigger sample size, we'll have more players in the range research report. For example, if we change the number of hands to 25, so we now have a low criteria for amount of hands in order for a player to pass through the filter. This opportunities here is going to have a big effect as well. Let's change it down to 10. We're going to get more results for this particular set of filters. So we have 257. Let's rebuild. Let's see how many players we get with the new set of filters. Slightly less stringent. You can see it's picking up players faster already with this particular range research report. So I'll just pause it. Let's see the result. So there were about 300 players, 333 that passed through this set of filters. Okay, so after watching this tutorial, we should have a good idea on how to use the expression string. Remember, we can go more advanced if we want to read some of the documentation. But this is the basic usage. Keep in mind the following pointers. We don't want a stat definition with brackets inside it. That tends to confuse the expression string. Also, make sure the specific stat we're trying to use has already been populated when the database has been rebuilt. That means that the database must be rebuilt after the stat's already been created, and that stat has to be in a pop-up somewhere in order to get processed. Alright, that's it. Thanks very much for watching. Have fun with the range research and generating your own expression strings.